Hi, welcome to Halton Stadium. My name's Paul Mains.
And I'm Scott Hawkes.
And we're clinical respiratory physiologists from Liverpool Heart and Chest Hospital.
And we're here today to talk about diagnosing respiratory disease and lung health.
Thanks for the introduction. So I'm Paul and this is Scott. I'm going to take you through our presentation today. So just a little bit about content. We're going to talk about the burden of lung disease. Some of the numbers will relate more to Liverpool because we have more data on that, but we're going to sort of show how that can transform and sort of help us to determine what we're going to be doing in terms of lung health in other regions. Determinants of lung health, so sort of modifiable factors, how we diagnose and how we test for lung disease, the benefits, some information on the inhaler technique, and a little bit about lung health. We will ask questions, but as we said before, it will be at the end. Just get through it. Because last time we sort of ran over a little bit with people asking questions during, so just save that towards the end for us, that'd be perfect. So some fun lung facts to open up with. Main one being, we breathe out 13 pints of air every minute. So all of the bars closed today, you will get your fill during today's talk, so that'll be hopefully enough for you. Lungs are the size of a tennis court, so if we look at surface area of the alveoli inside the lung where gas exchange takes place, if you were to open that up and spread that out, it will cover the size of a sort of Olympic size tennis court. So there is a lot of space in there, and that also then leads on to when there is disease present, you can show how quickly that can start to affect the person, especially with their breathing and their exercise tolerance.
Morning, everyone. Can you click the next one for us? Perfect. So why is lung disease important? Well, there's a huge burden of lung disease in this country and particularly in the northwest as well. So if we look closely at statistics, we've got over 500,000 new respiratory diagnoses made every year. Predominantly those look at things like asthma, which is the most prevalent, and then things like COPD as well. Okay. Interstitial lung diseases, which is this ILD here, they're relatively rare but quite complex respiratory diseases, and they're increasing, particularly as the population ages. So 12 million people in the UK live with a lung disease. Now we work at a heart and chest hospital, and hearts are kind of quite trendy and quite cool, we can fix them and people like it, but respiratory disease is always a bit less, it's a bit more difficult to manage, the disease is a bit more chronic, and so lots of people living with lung disease, but probably doesn't quite get the press or the awareness of maybe heart disease. So our job here today is to talk a bit about how we diagnose lung disease and why that lung health is important. Mortality is highest in the northwest, the northeast, and in Scotland. So it is a big issue, and it's a big issue to this local area as well. Anyone think of any factors why it's more prominent in the northwest? Industry, smoking. Yeah, smoking rates are a bit higher in the northwest than they are in other parts of the country, and the industry as well. So we do see a bit more cases of more rare lung diseases which can be caused by industry and the places people work. Death rates due to respiratory disease in the UK are the second highest in Europe. So we do have a problem in this country about how we manage and how we look after lung disease. Okay, lots of admissions, lots of money, and lots of time spent in hospitals. What the aim of probably healthcare, particularly in respiratory setting these days, is to not get people admitted into hospital, and that's where we get the problems. So what we don't want is admission rates being particularly high. We want to drive down admission rates, and part of what we do at the Liverpool Heart and Chest Hospital and the service we offer in the community is an early diagnostic service. The earlier you get the diagnosis, the earlier you get your treatment, the more you use your treatment, the less likely you are to get an admission, and that's where the complications arise when we get chronic lung disease. So we're looking at maybe 11 billion a year. It's expensive business as well. So one of the biggest issues here is the loss of the economy as well, so working days, and that particularly falls on people who maybe have to retire early, or people who have chronic diseases, things like cystic fibrosis or things like asthma as well, missing lots of time off work. So how does that relate more closely to the current area? So we're in the Halton area at the moment, and then we can look here, the death rates are 49 per 100,000 of the population with respiratory disease. To put that in context, Halton is higher than the northwest and is significantly higher than England. So there is a particular issue in this area as well. Okay, so death rates of COPD remain significantly higher than the northwest. So COPD is the problem. So as I said to you, it's all about getting that diagnosis and making the diagnosis earlier. Smoking prevalence, so there was a survey, a lifestyle survey. The prevalence is actually higher in Halton than it is in the wider country. So about 17% of people smoke in this country, but we're getting somewhere between 23 and 30% of the population, so smoking prevalence is higher here as well. The issue, well, not one of the issues, but if you look at the data, and particularly in the local area, it's about making a diagnosis. We work in the community as well, so obviously we work at the hospital, but myself and my colleagues will go out to the community in the Liverpool and in the Knowsley areas and offer diagnostic respiratory testing. The aim of maybe getting a quality diagnostic test done sooner. The issue with Halton is they do have a bit of an issue making those diagnoses, so they actually, in comparison to the predictions, they're not quite getting the target rate, so we're not making as many diagnoses as they'd expect in this local area. So this is interesting. Moving on, Paul.
So we're now going to look at some of the determinant factors of lung health. So some of them you will be born with, others that you will sort of gain across a lifetime, depending on how you live your life, how healthy you are, smoking, work environment, and how they not only affect you, but how you can modify that yourself. So how you can spot some of these things a little bit earlier and make some changes, or even if you've been diagnosed with a lung condition, you can still make changes and still push that sort of the issue back a little bit in terms of how much it will affect you across the rest of your life. Sorry, we're going to be like the two Ronnies today, I think. So some non-modifiable determinants. A lot of these are something that you were born with, or maybe contract despite how you live your life. So age is one. Unfortunately, even if you live the perfect lifestyle, once you reach a certain point, your lungs will start to fail, and it generally is either your heart or your lungs that will fail first. Women, for some unknown reason, are more likely to be susceptible. Sorry, can't get that one out today. Once you're diagnosed, at the sort of later years, we do tend to see women have higher rates than men, whether that is due to more women presenting at the GP earlier. You've got the sort of the cast iron figure of the man who, I don't go to the GP, I'm fine, leave me alone. And that may be contribute to this. Maybe it's just the fact that women have higher rates and we just don't understand why fully at the moment. Disability and learning disabilities comes under the same sort of blanket as that. It stops you being able to go to your GP. Communication difficulties can often play a part if you're struggling to put across the problems that you have and not being able to describe those problems. It makes life a little bit more difficult for us to determine what is happening. Maternal smoking, so a lot of the sort of non-modifiable determinants will come from prenatal issues, smoking around a pregnant woman, how they live their lifestyle, and that can often lead to babies being susceptible to lung conditions that we won't pick up with lung function testing for a long time, but you've already set that in stone before the baby's even born. Race and smoking rates. It's quite interesting that in some of the sort of poorer countries, especially the likes of India or what people often class as third world countries, tend to have a higher rates, especially in terms of mortality, in terms of lung disease and heart disease. And a lot of that is around poor healthcare. Little is known about the numbers that they have. We also have genetic factors as well, so people being born with genetic diseases that are being passed on. A lot of it is hereditary. People with COPD, often they're passing on those genetic factors to their children and then their children as well, so that it sort of travels on through the lines. And then seasonal factors, so summer to winter, you've got different pollen rates, the dampness of the air will all affect your chest in slightly different ways. And we often see over sort of September to maybe March, April is where you see the highest rate of emissions. And you might often see in the papers about winter crisis in the NHS, so we do have to put a lot of effort into winter planning. As Scott was saying, being in the community, what we want to do is try and reduce emissions as much as possible. So we sort of plan ahead for the winter crisis and then try and reduce that rate of people coming in so we can keep those beds free, but also reducing then admissions to keep you as healthy as possible and keep you out of the hospital. And just some modified determinants here as well. So smoking status is probably the main one. Stop smoking. It is as simple as that. The sooner you do that, the better the outcome. And you do hear these stories. I've smoked for a number of years. My GP said, don't stop smoking. There's no point if the damage is already done. It very may well be already done, but if you do stop, it is still going to benefit you. You will still retain some of that lung function. The more you smoke, the more you're going to exacerbate the condition. It gets worse and worse, and it'll progress a lot quicker. Air pollution and climate change, not something that the average Joe can modify themselves. You can move area. It's not very easy to do, but you can monitor these things. You can go online. You can look at the local air pollution and the levels day by day in your local area. So it is quite interesting to look at, especially if you live quite rurally and you might think that you've got better air quality, but you might find that the pollen counts are a lot higher. So if you've got asthma, that's probably not going to be the best thing for you. So prenatal factors. So obviously if you're pregnant, try and stay away from areas where people are smoking or smoking yourself. Nutritional deficiencies can contribute towards lung disease. If you're not sort of taking in those nutrients during pregnancy, that can affect the growth and the outcome of your child when they're born. And reduce physical activity. The healthier you'll be. Again, it's sort of, as it says on the tin, if you don't use it, you lose it. You might often hear that term being battered about a little bit. So the more you exercise, even though your exercise tolerance might be 10 to 15 metres, the more you do that, you can increase that to 15, 20, 25. So you will, if you push it a little bit safely, you will be able to sort of get back a little bit of that exercise tolerance that you may have lost after you've been diagnosed with your lung condition. Obesity, as it says there, particularly worse than asthma. The more weight you put on, it's going to affect your diaphragm, it's going to affect the muscles that you use to breathe. But it's also, if you were to pick up a weight and carry that weight around all day, it's going to impact your exercise, it's going to impact your tolerance to exercise. And often, when we gain weight, we don't consider it as how much weight we've actually put on. So if someone was to put, 10 kilograms on, you might not think that's a lot, but if you pick a 10 kilogram weight up and walk around with it all day, you would soon know about it. You will be knackered at the end of the day. And the occupational exposure. Now, the government are getting quite hot on sort of reducing risk around occupational exposure. So, particularly asbestos, silica, dust, anyone who works with sort of biological powders, flour, any of these industries, they're quite hot now on personal protective equipment and making sure that you're wearing masks, that you're in well-ventilated areas. But there is whole generations where this wasn't in place. So we are starting to notice this now 30, 40 years on, particularly with asbestos, that you see these factors come into play where people have got lung conditions now. And unfortunately, once you're diagnosed with asbestosis, pneumoconiosis from the coal industry, it's already happened, and unfortunately there's little that can be done apart from just managing that condition. But it's taken those 30, 40 years for us to realise the effect that these chemicals and these dust and things have. And it is quite a widespread issue.
Yeah, that sums up with this as a whole.
Yeah, it will do.
Big factors like in
It will do, and there's one thing that Scott touched on before in terms of the Halton area having a problem. When you come out to these areas where there has been a lot more industry, there are a lot more big factories, it will affect the whole of the area, not just the people who work there, because a lot of the stuff was being pumped out into the air. Obviously that area is surrounding the local area, and then everyone's breathing it. So it isn't good for the local area.
Excuse me, will you have asbestos in people's houses as well?
You can do. One of the issues with asbestos is it's completely safe if untouched. It's only when you drill through or you break it up and fibres are released into the air, it's the fibre particles when you breathe them in. So if it's in the wall, they take it out now to be certain that no one's going to touch it. But if you left the sheet of it untouched, the likelihood is of you contacting asbestosis is quite low. It's only when you break it apart, but they do take it out of the buildings now anyway, just to be sure, because you never know when someone's going to knock a nail in the wall, or want to knock a wall down, or any pipes are being removed that's got this stuff surrounding it. But it is relatively safe on its own if it's just held back and untouched.
Right, we'll do some more interesting stuff. So this is more about, well, it's all interesting, but this is mine and Paul's day-to-day job. So we're trying to diagnose lung disease and help make a diagnosis. So we do quite a lot of diagnostic tests at the hospital. So the one that probably most commonly aware of is a test called spirometry. That's where you take one really big breath in and blow out as hard as you can. We'll go on to that in a bit more detail and why is it such a useful test. We do some bronchodilator studies, some peak flow monitoring, and some of these other things we'll go through in a bit more detail. Okay, so we'll start off with the spirometry. So put your hand up here if you've done a spirometry breathing test before. Yeah, quite a few of you. And it's a very, very useful test, okay? One of the most useful and one of the cheapest tests that we do in the NHS. So all you need to do is take a big breath in and blow up as hard as you can. And in fact, our colleague at the back there, Molly can give us away, she's going to do some tests later if anyone wants to have a go, okay? So it's really easy, and what it helps, it's a diagnostic test where we can look at airflow limitation or limitations to the size of someone's lungs. So there are two things that can be abnormal in a spirometry test. You can have small lungs or you can have reduced flow, and those give us different or relate to different conditions. So obstructive lung diseases, COPD, it's in the 9, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and asthma as well fits under that. There are other conditions that look at obstructive flow, things like cystic fibrosis as well, so genetic conditions, and there's another one called alpha-1 which follows a similar pattern to COPD, but it's a genetic condition that you might be born with. So, nice easy test, very commonly used, does reflect your lung health pretty well, and we do tend to do serial spirometries on patients who have a diagnosis of lung disease to see if the treatment's working, look at the severity of the disease. Once the disease becomes more severe, you might be eligible for more treatments or be considered for more advanced pharmaceutical therapy, etc. So, very useful. And in terms of looking at restricted lung diseases, they're a bit more niche, they're not quite as common, not quite as well known about, but that's when you lose volume to your lungs, so your lungs become smaller, okay? And restricted lung diseases are kind of on the up, so you might have heard of a condition called pulmonary fibrosis, which is becoming more and more talked about, and it tends to be idiopathic in nature, so that means we don't really know what causes it, but it can be relatively aggressive depending on what the reason you have, or the reason you've developed it, or what type of fibrosis you have, but it's fairly common in the population as you get older.
Can that be caused by heart disease?
Not to my... Some of the medications, yeah, you can get fibrosis from some of the medications you have. You can get fibrosis from some of the chemotherapy agents as well, they might use in certain cancers, so you can get scarring of your lungs, lots of different reasons. Let's move on. So why is that important to what we do? So as I mentioned to you already, we do a lot of spirometry testing in Liverpool Heart and Chest. We do a lot in the hospital and we do a lot in the community. And this is important for us because the community work really drives the service, and actually it's a very novel service because we have a department of about 25, maybe more members of staff, and we'll send about 4 or 5 people out every day in the community to do diagnostic testing. The issue is that spirometry sounds nice and straightforward, but actually to get a good test and to do it well does require a level of skill. So we have a team of physiologists that are all trained up to a certain degree, whereas in some places you might get a nurse practitioner who's just been asked to have a go and make them blow into a tube. And actually the quality of the testing is the important thing, and that's what we want to do. We want to drive up the standards of the testing because, as we already outlined to you, an earlier diagnosis is essential. So we go out to the Liverpool service, and we'll go to the Nosey service as well. I think we roughly go to about 17 or 18 different sites across a week, and we'll be doing diagnostic tests there, and then we'll be doing annual tests on patients who have a known condition, and that really helps. And as you can see here, as part of this service, we're doing 12, maybe 13,000 tests every year, and that service is expanding. So we're now doing it into hard-to-reach groups, so people who may not regularly attend for appointments, so typically we'll go to like a methadone clinic and try and perform there because there's lots of undiagnosed respiratory disease. And that's really one of the novel parts of working in Liverpool. What it helps us do, or the Liverpool Heart and Chest, it helps us look at prevalence in a bit more detail. So although I haven't got a map for the area we're in now, if we look at the Liverpool area, and if you know the Liverpool area relatively well, you can see that the darker the green, using the line here, the darker the green areas, the higher the prevalence of COPD. And we have so much data now, we've been doing the service for the years. Yeah, so we've got a whole massive amount of data which we're going to look to do some research in to look at the areas. But if you look commonly here in the north of Liverpool, we're getting higher rates of COPD, and in the slightly more affluent south parts of Liverpool, a lot less. And then at Speak at the bottom here, what's in Speak? The airport, yeah, exactly right. And we suspect that you might have high levels around the airport, and definitely going to have more levels of asthma as well. Okay, just because of the pollutants from the aircraft. So, will you have any comments?
It's also quite interesting.
As Scott's talking about the pollution from the airport, if we go up to the sort of northern regions of the city, this is where all the docklands are. So you will always have higher rates around docklands because of the pollutants from the ships. Obviously there's a lot of waste product as well that is taken away from the city by the Mersey. So where these areas are flowing, what it helps us to do is build the data in that area to say, right, this is a high rate of COPD. So should we be spending as much money in this area targeting COPD if the rates aren't high? So then what that will then allow us to do, if we move the resources that we have at the hospital into the right areas, we can target specific places that have the higher rate of COPD to see if we can control that, treat it better, and then bring those rates down over time. And then what this has allowed us to do over the past 10 or 15 years is also expand. So we started in Liverpool with a number of sites. Liverpool expanded, we went into Knowsley, Knowsley's expanded, and then you sort of start to push out to the wider areas so we can bring the data from this test and the diagnosis that we've got at the hospital into Holton and allow us to plan better so we can facilitate. It's a more of a cohesive experience for the patient. We're not just sort of turning up one day and saying, oh well, we're here now, we might not be here next week. We can target a specific area and say, right, we're going to come into this area, we're going to test as many people as we can, gather the data, and that will then allow us, again, to sort of cherry pick the areas where we need to be, as opposed to the areas where we probably don't need as many clinics. And that might have its difficulties in itself, but if you've got lower rates of COPD here, there's no point in putting as many clinics in these areas as in these areas, because we know it's not needed.
Yeah, I think when this is a bit of a drag out.
Yeah, it will tend to happen when you have sort of major cities and then another major city and then a piece of land that sort of sits between, you know, Liverpool and Manchester. There's a lot of area. Who covers that area? Obviously, it will come under a catchment area for the NHS, and you know, which sort of GP practices, CCGs and things will look after you. But obviously, you're more likely, unfortunately, to be diagnosed in a bigger city than you are in a more rural area. It's harder to sort of get out into those catchment areas, but this is the type of thing that we want to, as Scott was saying, drive up the rate, the compliance, the data that we've got, the quality of the testing, and then expand that out to areas. So there is no sort of health economy, if you will. Everyone has the same diagnostics, the same level of testing. So another part that we do on the back of the spirometry test is a bronchodilator study. So this is basically do a spirometry test with you. One or two of you in the room may have had this done, where we will give you an inhaler of some sort or a nebulized version of this. So depending on where you go or whether it's done in the hospital or the community, might depend how we do this. But then we just test your response to that. And the reason we do that is that if you've got COPD, you see very little response. Sometimes you do get a bit of a response in terms of your lung volume, but mainly it's seen in asthma. So the high level of response is a diagnostic indicator of asthma. It's not the only thing that's used. There are like sort of clinical histories, peak flow trials. There's a lot more data that we gather before we say you've got asthma and how we're going to handle it for you. But mainly the testing that we do currently in the community revolves around spirometry and then testing against the bronchodilator. And then once we know that response, we sort of have that as a baseline. So every time you come back to see us, we don't have to do that again because we know what your response to that inhaler is. If you're on your inhalers, if you're taking that therapy every day and you're using it as prescribed, then we know that we can just monitor you then ongoing.
I think so. We'll move on. So it's not just about taking one big breath in and blowing out as hard as you can, as long as you can. There's lots of other tests we do as well. So this is a relatively new test. It's a test called a FeNO, it's a fractional pale nitric oxide test. And all it does, it measures the levels of airways inflammation. High levels of airways inflammation is almost definitely linked to asthma. So it's a relatively new test, and under the NICE guidelines of 2017 for asthma, a high FeNO is diagnostic of asthma. Why is that important? Well, we think of asthma as one condition and maybe COPD as another, but actually asthma is an umbrella term for lots of conditions. So you can have different types. So you have very brittle asthma, which is very obvious where people have asthma attacks, or you have more subtle forms of asthma where you might have a normal spirometry test, but you might still have a diagnosis of asthma. So this is specific to airways inflammation. So a raised FeNO is diagnostic of asthma these days, and it's relatively new. It makes our life a little bit easier because if someone does this test, which is a bit more simple than performing spirometry, we've made the diagnosis already, and actually it's very convenient testing. Typically, people will have these on serial loop, so depending on their response to steroid inhalers. So typically, well, the importance is that making the wrong diagnosis will affect people's treatment pathways as well, because you're licensed for different drugs in asthma, as you are in the COPD as well, and the long-term treatment options are different. So nice new test, relatively new. We do quite a lot of them. I think we do it in the Knowsley service, but we're going to be rolling it out, I think, to the Liverpool service in the next year. Help us make more diagnosis. Right, I'll do this one as well. So has anyone done a full lung function test? Anyone? No? Oh, someone at the back there, yeah. Excellent. So full lung function testing, nice and straightforward. There's 3 parts to the test. We do spirometry, which we've already discussed, and then we look at 2 other parts of it. So we do a gas transfer test, and we look at someone's lung volumes. Now, these tests also help us make diagnosis, because although we might not have a high FeNO, we might have normal spirometry, we can still have other forms of lung disease. So a gas transfer test tells us how efficient the process of oxygen transfer happens in our lungs. The key for all of us is, as we're walking around, so we're doing exercise, we breathe, and oxygen goes from our lungs into our blood supply. If that process is hampered, then that part of that gas exchange isn't efficient. So with a gas transfer test, we ask people to inhale gas combinations, carbon monoxide, and we use methane, hold their breath for a few seconds, and then blow back out. And it works out how efficient that process is. So for example, asthma is a condition of your airways and not your lung tissue. COPD tends to be a condition of both your airways and your lung tissue, so they might have a reduced gas transfer, whereas someone in asthma won't have a reduced gas transfer because it's not a condition of the lung tissue. And then if we flip to looking more interstitial lung diseases, that's almost always going to have a reduced gas transfer where they've got scarring on their lungs. So there's not so much healthy lung for the gas exchange process to happen. But we can use it for other things as well. So typically people who are achieving some chemotherapy treatments will have serial gas transfer measurements to see if it's affecting their lungs, because they might change the strength or the dose of their treatment. And also, a lot of the work we do at the NHS in terms of thoracic surgery. So is someone fit for lung surgery? Are they fit for heart surgery? We know that when you have surgery, you're going to have an increased demand for oxygen to recover from your surgery. So we might do a gas transfer test to determine if someone's fit for surgery, as it were, particularly if they're having surgery on their lungs or they're looking to remove part of the lung. And then the lung volumes. That's what the box is for. We shut people in, not for very long, only for a few minutes, and we're going to try and work out how big their lungs are. And I know the other tests look at how big your lungs are, but there's always what we call a residual volume of air left in your lungs. And so when you blow all the way out, your lungs are never empty, and we have this residual volume, but in certain disease processes, that residual volume will be increased. And it's quite a useful test, again, to help us make a diagnosis when we're not quite sure. So we do quite a lot of them, and I would say I quite like doing them on patients, but Paul, do you like doing them? I don't think the patients like doing them. Right, we'll move on.
Okay, so one of the other tests that we do, and we tend to do this type of test in a hospital environment, just because essentially you're trying to trigger an event. So anyone who's got asthma who might have reactive airways, so you will have a trigger in the air, so pollen, or you might be sensitive to perfumes, sprays, biological agents, so like sort of washing powder. What we get these people to do is perform a spirometry test, so you have your known standard, and that's what we want to try and keep you at. And then we get you to inhale a dry powder, so it's like a sugar substitute, and it just irritates the airway by changing the osmolality in the cell. So it basically just changes the amount of fluid that comes in and out of the cell in the lining of the airways. So because we do that, you can potentially trigger an asthma attack, so it has to be done in a safe and a clinical environment, just so we can make sure you're not harmed in any sense. But these are quite good for people who've got asthma, but it's quite difficult to detect. You can have a spirometry test done, you can have a full study done, you might have a FeNO done, and all of these tests may be inconclusive or seem normal at the time. But with a challenge test, you tend to find the people who have a lung condition who are relatively fit. So this works quite well, quite often. But it's not a very nice test to have done. You inhale the dry powder, you wait a minute, you're doing a spirometry test, and that continues for about 15 to 20 minutes. And unfortunately, people think we're cracking the whip, but you have to be quite strict on the time and the dosages, otherwise the cumulative effect of the drug doesn't work properly. So you are sort of tablet blow, tablet blow, tablet blow. So it's not a great experience for the patient, to be fair, but it has got quite a high sensitivity for reactive lung diseases.
I'm very proud of the work we do at Liverpool Heart and Chest Hospital and of the services that we're expanding. We're going through lots of expansion in the last years, and the exercise testing service we do now is part of that. And we're probably nearing on one of the busiest services in the country for developing cardiopulmonary exercise testing. And that's mainly because we do it from lots of different ways. We'll look at all the congenital heart disease patients who have regular exercise testing. We have a sports cardiology clinic where we get some professional athletes in as well, who might have early maybe changes to their hearts. People with inherited cardiac conditions, respiratory disease, and people who have thoracic surgery. And why exercise testing is really good is that all the tests that we make you do sitting down, doing nothing. And all the cardiac tests they do, you do sitting down, doing nothing. And that's not where we get breathless. No one is sitting in this room right now, out of breath, huffing and puffing, but it's when we walk around, when we go up a flight of stairs, when we go to the shops, when we're carrying heavy bags, that's when we get out of breath. And so exercise testing has kind of been just thereabouts, and now it's becoming, in the last 10, 15 years, a very prominent way of looking at diagnosing diseases because it actually quantifies the disease process better. So it's very, very popular, but it's becoming a lot more popular in how we diagnose conditions. Now, a lot of people might have a bit of a lung condition, they might have a bit of a heart condition as well, but what is that limiting factor? Because that's going to help the doctors that we work with and the consultants make decisions on what your treatment might be. A lot of the time people might have a respiratory condition, but actually it might not be performance limiting, and it's because of their heart medication, they can't get their heart rate up. And this test is really novel, and it helps make a diagnosis. And we're probably doing, maybe last year we did about 250 of them, this year we're probably going to do about 500 of them, so we're really upping the service, and that's helping it develop. And I must say, I mean, obviously you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not from this area, I'm a southerner, and I used to work at a specialist heart and chest hospital down in London, and I think the very novel thing about Liverpool here is that at the moment we are expanding in a way where I've not seen another department do that in terms of respiratory physiology, and how, particularly in the community service, we're driving everything forward. And so at the moment I feel very proud to work there because I think we're delivering high quality care, and part of that is expanding all the services we do. So everything we're doing more of, and we're doing more of it in the last few years than we've ever done, and it's really helping deliver care to the patients in the area. So we're quite proud of that. Let's move on. So I'll give this one back to Paul.
Tackle the easy one there, Scott. So smoking and lung function, it's one of the biggest challenges that we face day to day, is trying to get people to stop smoking. And it's not the easiest thing in the world. A lot of people can just come into a clinic and say, smoke, you deliver the unfortunate news that they've got a lung disease of some kind, and you can stop there and then on the dot. I'll quit smoking today. Other people take years and years and years as a sort of a progressive reduction in the number you smoke, or the use of e-cigarettes, or patches and other bits that the GP can prescribe to sort of help sort of curb the cravings, if you will. But this graph, what it demonstrates, the black line at the top is you probably say the average person's lung function over a lifetime, and that is a natural decline. So as we were saying before, as soon as you're born, eventually it'll be your lungs or your heart that fail, mainly your lungs first, and you can see that sort of gradual slope. The red line underneath is your projected lung function over a lifetime for a smoker, and you can see that's quite drastic. And that is a fairly heavy reduction in your overall lung volumes being on the left-hand side. So what we say here is your FEV1, which is when you do a spirometry test, when you blast out, we measure the first second and we look for what we call dynamic airway compression. So to see how well the tissue in your lungs compresses and then opens back up. So the decline in that is what we rate when we look at COPD. So we look at the overall test, which will say you've got an obstructive lung condition, then we look at your FEV1, and your FEV1 is the bit that tells us how bad that condition is. And it might be sort of mild, moderate, severe, very severe. What we see with the green line is someone who's smoked up until the sort of 40s, 50s, they've quit smoking, and that is the difference that it can make to your lung function. And again, it's pretty drastic by just quitting smoking there and carrying forward. And in this line at the bottom here, we've sort of gone beyond the point of saviour, if you will, with the smoking there. But it still shows, even at lower lung volumes, at lower percentages, it can still make a significant difference by quitting smoking. And that's why it is always an option. Despite what people say is, oh, you've smoked for too many years, the damage is done, you might as well carry on. That is proof, because this is taken from national data. I think, is it over 1 million people that's got? Maybe over 1 million people. That is the change that it can make, even once you've gone past that barrier, which is, I'd probably say that's sort of severe to very severe COPD. So someone who's got fairly advanced lung disease, it can still make a massive change in terms of the expected number of years that you can live with that condition.
I'll do this one very quickly. I'm not going to talk too much about e-cigarettes. I think they're going to be bad for you. We just don't know they're bad for you yet. We know from all experience that putting chemicals in our lungs, whether it's at work, whether it's smoking, it's been bad for you. And we'll probably find out when there's some more long-term studies that e-cigarettes aren't any good for you. I would only encourage people to use them as a stepping stone to quitting and no other reason. You see people use them as well, and they kind of just sit on them all day, and they probably smoke more with their e-cigarette than they do with a cigarette. So I think there's no good evidence to continue using them or to take them up instead of smoking and then continue using them in the same amounts. We'll leave it there. Air quality. You can't really change the quality of the air. I guess if we all decided to get electric cars or get the bus or whatever, or cycle to work, we could. But if you look on the local website, you can see the air pollution for the area. So this was this weekend, relatively low. So we can enjoy activities. Now, if you do have a lung disease or you do have a heart condition, you might not notice the pollution levels, but if they are higher, you should probably avoid doing exercise in certain areas. I mean, it sounds really simple, but it doesn't necessarily, you're not going to go, oh, because you can't see pollution outside the window. But if you can check it, I would only exercise when the pollution levels are low, particularly if you find yourself getting more breathless, even going for a walk. Air quality is important. It's becoming more important. We probably know more about it, or you've heard more about it in the last 5 years than you've ever heard about air quality. And they're looking to push it, particularly the World Health Organization. They suggest that everyone who lives in Europe loses 12 months of their life expectancy because of the quality of the air. And there is a drive in this city, and if you look in Manchester as well, to really drive down the number of people who are driving in inner cities. So that's interesting. Air pollution. So air pollution, again, very similar. Difference being here, can we change air pollution? Well, we could. I guess if we all moved in the middle of the Lake District or the Peaks, we could probably improve the quality of our air. Not necessarily practical for a lot of people to move away from families, jobs, work, but you notice that the closer you live to a busy road or highway, the more likely you are to have a chronic cough and a wheeze. Are we surprised? Probably not, particularly if you live near a petrol station as well. You're probably more likely to have a chronic cough and a wheeze. So the answers are, if you've got lung disease or if you want to get away from those environments, you need to move away from living in a city. Don't live on a busy road, and definitely don't live near a petrol station. But that's not always practical advice for a lot of people to tell them to move house. So we know it's bad for you, air pollution, usually a year of your life, but smoking's much worse. So the number one thing is smoking, and then things like air pollution will help as well.
So exercise and lung health, as we probably said throughout the talk, if you don't use it, you lose it. And to increase your exercise, when someone says to you, you've got an active lung disease, it's probably a little bit worrying. You think, well, I've got a disease chest, can I exercise? Everyone can exercise to a limit, and that is something that we really need to focus on and we really need to push. Whether that be, sort of getting up in your living room, just walking 10 yards forward and backwards in a safe way, whether it's just doing some steps on the bottom step of your stairs. The more you increase your exercise, the more you push blood into your lungs, the healthier that tissue will be. So the healthy tissue, we're trying to get as much oxygenation and blood to that as possible. That will increase how breathless you will not become by exercise. Some of the information that you can find, and that's going to be a little bit varied in terms of what you should and what you shouldn't be doing if you've got a condition like COPD or asthma. But the best thing to do is just to consult with your GP and say, this is the condition I've been told I've got, what is a safe way for me to exercise and continue to exercise. Often, so our service at the hospital, we have a team who'll go out to the community just to give you some ideas around how to exercise safely. We have the pulmonary rehabilitation back at the hospital, so services where you might go for a 6-week course, they'll get you on a treadmill just doing a few steps, but because it's done in a safe environment, they can often then say, well, look, this is actually your exercise tolerance. You may think you can only do 10, 30 yards, but actually you can do 100 yards. And if you do that 2 or 3 times a week, you will start to notice the benefit over time. And this is just a couple of sort of cycles with the inactivity and the activity. So when you're looking at the inactivity, you do less, your muscles become weaker. It's a little bit less efficient in terms of your oxygen demand and then the support of those muscles. You feel breathless, and then this is the main one, you become fearful of the activities. And you do see a lot of people who we diagnose in clinics, and one of the main things I'd say to them is, your life isn't over because you're being diagnosed with COPD. You just need to manage what you do. A lot of people will start to say, oh, well, you know, I can't go here, my son or my daughter wants to take me out, but I can't go because I've got COPD. It shouldn't really stop you. It should just focus your mind on what you can and can't do. Obviously, if they're going to go for a 5-mile walk, you probably wouldn't keep up. But, you know, you could probably do a mile walk at a slower pace. So it's just about managing and knowing what your level is, not, I'm going to sit down now and do nothing, because that's, in effect, worse. And then as we come around to that, so you avoid the activities, you do less, and then that cycle continues. Whereas it is polar opposite when you do have some activity in your lifestyle, so you're keeping that strength in your muscles, the oxygen demand is better, and you're more efficiently using your oxygen that you're taking. You become less breathless over time, you do feel better, but you feel motivated. If someone says to you you've got a lung condition, but you can still live your life currently how you're living it, then there shouldn't be very few changes involved in that. So just keep going day to day as you are. Don't let it sort of change your life. Just let it focus on what you want to do and how you're going to do that.
Last little bit. Just going to quickly go over some inhaler techniques. Anyone here take inhalers? And what percentage of the population do you think take their inhalers properly? Yeah, 50%, spot on. Yeah, we reckon about 50% of people use their inhalers properly, so most people don't tend to use them correctly. We find that men over 65 are the most compliant with their inhalers, so congratulations there. But there's lots of different devices, and I think a lot of times people don't take them because they don't feel any benefit. I think that's the key reason people don't use their inhalers. Typically, you can see the blue inhalers, salbutamol is probably the most common inhaler. It's a bronchodilator, it opens up your airways. People do get quite a bit of benefit from that, and so they tend to use that. Other forms of inhaler, here, they might contain low amounts of steroids or longer acting drugs. People tend to not use them because they don't feel the benefit, but actually what they're doing is a silent job, which is they're either damping down things like your inflammation, and that's what is more key in terms of reducing exacerbation rates than the bronchodilator therapy. So the key is people aren't using their inhalers to use them, and use them as prescribed. And a lot of the waste in NHS is people who pick up their prescriptions every month and then never take them. And I've seen someone return a bag of 10 or 15 steroid inhalers. They're about 35, depending on which, £35 each one, and they haven't used a single one of them. They just pick up the prescription every month. So it is careful, and if people aren't using their inhalers or they're not happy with the device, as you can see, there are plenty of other devices, so you can change them. So we'll go through a couple of them. So lots of different devices. MDI inhalers, which is this device here, and the pink one, are the most commonly used in the UK. They're not widely used in other countries. People tend to use a dry powder inhaler. So if we look at this device here, dry powder inhalers. I'll go through these relatively quickly, these slides, as we are probably slightly overrunning. So inhaler-wise, does anyone use a spacer when they use their inhaler? Yeah. Good technique, that's the way you should use it. You're going to get more of the inhaler into your lungs. Not necessarily practical to carry one round with you, but you should be using a spacer where you can. We opt in that you breathe in and out slowly when you take the inhaler, rather than just going. You'll find that people struggle to get that technique right, so they'll push it, and then most inhaler won't go in, or they'll hit the back of their lungs. So nice steady breath in, and that's how we take our inhalers. Similar devices, so these are all similar devices, but you'll find if you look at this one on the far, not that I work for GlaxoSmithKline, but this is one of the new drugs, which is a triple therapy drug. So there's a couple of triple therapy devices out there now, aim being that you should only need to take one inhaler rather than take 3 inhalers. So these are only on the market probably the last 2 or 3 years. They're getting far more popular, far more common. They're a bit more expensive, but they're much cheaper than being prescribed 3 different inhalers. So there are, I think, at least 2 or 3 different devices for that now, the triple therapy. And as I say, becoming far more common. For these, empty your lungs first, place your mouth around the mouthpiece, and you breathe in, and the breath activates the device. Okay? So common errors, people don't breathe out first, so they're not taking a nice full breath in, so they're going to get less lung deposition, so by that less of the inhaler is going to get into your lung tissue. Not holding your breath, people just tend to blow it straight back out. Well, that's not going to do anything. Not shaking your MDI before use, so make sure you shake it correctly first. Inhaling too early before pressing the canister, you see that a lot. And it all shoots out the top, doesn't get into your lungs, not going to do anything. Inhaling too late, or not leaving enough time between doses as well. Okay, the canister needs a bit of time. Roughly how long do we take, Paul? About a minute for the reset? To reset, so you shouldn't just shoot, you won't get much on that second dose. Okay. Tips, if you're using an inhaler, make sure the correct inhaler technique that works for you. If you have any difficulty with the device, your GP can prescribe you lots of different devices that might work better for you. Use a spacer with your steroid inhaler as well as your bronchodilator. And with the steroid inhalers, I'd say put them next to your toothbrush because you normally take them morning and night. And you brush your teeth afterwards, rinse your mouth out, otherwise you can develop things like thrush, oral thrush with the steroid inhaler. So that's my top tip there. Right.